Operation Cobra, the American breakout at Avranches on the 25th of July 1944, lifted the lid off the can in which the Germans sought to confine the Allies after the D-Day landings in Normandy 7 weeks earlier. Until then, the German defence, savage, hard-fought and extremely costly, had managed to hold the line against all Allied attempts to progress very far beyond the beachheads and move on into the rest of France. This was accomplished despite critical shortages of men and material, and the impossible demands of Adolf Hitler, whose basic and only strategy was never retreat, never surrender, and fight to the last man. After several failed attempts made at tremendous cost, the British and Canadians had at last established control over the northern districts by the 10th of July. But the Germans were still holding out in the south and southeast, and Operation Goodwood, the attempt to dislodge them, had failed disastrously on the 18th of July. This failure caused hot controversy within the Allied High Command. There was heavy criticism of General Bernard Montgomery, the British commander of the 21st Army Group, who had initiated Goodwood. US General Omar Bradley believed that Montgomery was going to be sacked. Montgomery remained, but at the height of the arguments, Operation Cobra completely changed the picture. Its success negated all the advantages the Germans still retained in France and made further defence irrelevant. For the Germans, the imperative now was to escape and preserve what they could of their hard-pressed forces for the defence of the fatherland. The situation after the success of Operation Cobra was symptomatic of the Axis war effort as a whole. Neither Germany nor Japan could match the industrial might of the Allies, and their losses, which the Allies could absorb, were slowly strangling their war efforts. After 5 years of a war that had seen their early spectacular victories, both Germans and Japanese were on the run, fighting desperately to prevent the enemy from closing in on their home territories. The Japanese were being chased from one Pacific island to the next and fought with manic desperation. Often they reacted to defeat by committing seppuku, ritual suicide. The finishing line for the Americans' island-hopping campaigns was the islands of Japan themselves, which to the Japanese were sacred soil. For them, the fate of their divine emperor Hirohito was also at stake. But by mid-1944, the noose was tightening fast as the Americans reached Guam in the Mariana Islands in the West Pacific. Guam was about 1,100 miles from the nearest Japanese territory, the Bonin Islands. And the Americans had those vital advantages: command of the air and of the seas. In Europe, the Germans were being assailed in the east and the south as well as the west. By 1944, the Russians had advanced beyond their own borders to force the surrender of Germany's ally Romania and enter the Bulgarian capital, Sofia. In southern Europe, despite the masterly defence put up by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the Allies had captured Rome, Rimini and Florence and were pressurising the Germans' Gothic defence line. Under these immense pressures, Hitler's ideas for staving off disaster had turned bizarre. His vengeance weapons, the V-1 pilotless flying bomb and the V-2 rocket, were the stuff of fantasy science fiction. The vengeance was Hitler's answer to the Allied bombing of Germany, but the notion that the V-weapons might turn the course of the war in Germany's favour was also present. In England, the first V1, which was powered by a pulse jet engine and carried a 1-ton warhead, fell on London on the 13th of June 1944. The throaty roar of its engine, then the sudden silence as it cut out and the V1 plunged to earth, was a terrifying moment for everyone who heard it. The V2 liquid-fueled rocket, 46 feet long and weighing 13 tons, was able to fall out of the sky with only a whisper of sound as a last-minute warning that always came too late. The sheer craziness of the V-weapon campaign doubtless played its part in a plot to kill Hitler that had been brewing since 1942. On the 20th of July 1944, a one-armed veteran, Count Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg, placed a briefcase containing a time bomb beneath a heavy oak map table in a hut at Hitler's Rastenburg headquarters. The bomb blew up at 12:42 hours during a high-level conference, but Adolf Hitler was not among the dead. He had, it seems, been saved by the thickness of the tabletop. The Führer's revenge was terrible. Around 200 people were put on trial and executed. Some of them had been only on the periphery of the plot, but implication was enough. Several high-ranking suspects were obliged to kill themselves, including Erwin Rommel, who was in hospital after suffering a fractured skull when his staff car was strafed on the 17th of July. General Ludwig Beck, former Chief of the General Staff, and Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who took over Rommel's command after he was injured. Kluge was sacked within a month for failing to warn Hitler of the bomb plot. Hitler had always entertained deep hatred and jealousy of the Prussian officer class, to which von Stauffenberg and other high-ranked conspirators belonged, and came to believe that the entire Wehrmacht was riddled with them. He wasn't wrong either. The German army had been the focus of several plots to assassinate the Führer since before the war. Army officers, for their part, had contempt for Hitler and his fanciful ideas of military strategy, which had already brought disaster and shame on the German army in Russia. Fear, suspicion, and the dread that Hitler's vengeance might fall on anyone at any time was a corrosive factor in the plight of German commanders in France. All the more so when their task was to save what they could of their remaining forces and extricate them from the Allied trap that began to close after Operation Cobra. US General George Smith Patton, Jr. was a hot-headed, egotistical commander, but one whose capacity for aggression made it impossible for General Eisenhower to dismiss him. Patton's behavior gave Eisenhower plenty of opportunity. The incident in Sicily, when he slapped the face of a young soldier suffering from battle fatigue, made Patton notorious. He did it again a week later. Though he apologized, Patton was relegated and spent almost a year kicking his heels before he was given command of the US Third Army in January 1944. But Patton's stern war face and his mask of insensitivity and swaggering self-confidence hid a man of too much emotion and too much self-doubt to justify his own concept of an effective military commander. War, said Patton, is very simple, direct, and ruthless. It takes a simple, direct, and ruthless man to wage war. In this context, Patton's performance as a hard-nosed bully was impeccable. Not surprisingly, he aroused opposing reactions. He was hated and admired in equal measure. The contrast between the pugnacious Patton and the self-effacing General Omar Nelson Bradley could hardly have been more complete. Whereas Patton was always hot news for war correspondents, Bradley's understated style of command afforded little copy. Bradley failed to distinguish himself at West Point, and the first 28 years of his military career were frustrating. His assignments kept him at home in the United States, and he once remarked that he spent the years between the First and Second World Wars apologizing for his lack of combat experience. But those years were far from wasted. As a tutor at West Point, Fort Benning and Leavenworth Infantry School, Bradley developed his tactical skills and his own sympathetic style for the handling of troops. In 1943, Bradley transferred to the North African Front, where he served as Eisenhower's advisor, and at last saw action when he led the 2nd Corps of Patton's 7th Army in Sicily. The following year, in Normandy, Bradley commanded the 1st Army on D-Day, and later saw them through the long, laborious struggle to overcome German resistance in the Cotentin Peninsula. At last, the war correspondents had something to write about. Noting how greatly Bradley was admired by his troops, the journalists labelled him the Soldiers' General. Field Marshal Gunther Hans von Kluge was one of the elder statesmen among German military commanders in the Second World War. His career had begun as long ago as 1901. Later, Kluge was in command of Army Group Centre, which challenged but failed to overcome the Russian defenders of Moscow in the winter of 1941. In July 1944, when Hitler dismissed Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Kluge replaced him as overall commander of the German forces defending France. But by this time, Kluge had realized that Hitler's strategy meant the destruction of the army. Kluge became extremely pessimistic about Germany's chances in the war, but he never discovered if his prognosis was correct. Hitler suspected that he was implicated in the bomb plot of the 20th of July. He was relieved of his command on the 17th of August and ordered back to Germany. 2 days later, while on the way, Kluge killed himself at Metz in northeastern France. Late in June 1944, Colonel General Paul Hauser was given command of the 7th Army, despite the protests of Erwin Rommel. Like Kluge, Hauser came from a long-established military family. He was 64 years old and a convinced Nazi, which Rommel was not. Hauser had seen service in the First World War, but defeat in 1918 left him anxious for a chance to restore Germany's military reputation. Hauser's command of the 7th Army was a poisoned chalice. It was already in a parlous state after a month of desperate defence in Normandy, and in the subsequent retreat through the Falaise-Argentin Gap suffered more losses in men and material. Hauser was one of those who managed to get away, riding to safety on a Panther tank, but he was badly wounded and had to relinquish his command. Hauser, who appeared as a witness for the defence at the Nuremberg trials, was a long-term survivor of the Second World War. He was 92 when he died in 1972. The strategy of the Allies after the breakout from Normandy was complete on the 31st of July 1944 was to converge on the Germans as they attempted to escape from France through the gap between Argentin and Falaise. If the Allies could eliminate the main German armies in France, it would serve as a virtual death blow, removing them from the scene as the Allies advanced towards the German border and invaded the fatherland itself. The Allied forces certainly seemed capable of such a feat. By the 1st of August, the US Third Army had been unveiled, General George Patton commanding. The Third Army formed part of the new US 12th Army Group, commanded by General Omar Bradley, which also included the 1st Army, led by the taciturn Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges. Patton's force took up position on the right of the Allied line. The British were on the left, comprising the 21st Army Group, which had been expanded to include Lieutenant General Henry Creerer's Canadian 1st Army. To the Canadians' right was the British 2nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Miles Dempsey. With military power of these proportions against a critically decimated German army, there was talk that the Second World War in Europe could be over before 1944 came to an end. The gap between Argentin and Falaise was the obvious exit from France, and the German 7th and 5th Army, formerly Panzer Group West, headed for it, hoping to elude the Allied pincer movement that was about to build up against them. The best the Germans could do now was somehow fight their way through before the Allies closed the gap. Top German commanders were pessimistic about their prospects, but among the lower ranks, who probably knew less about their real situation, hope was not yet lost. Some faint hearts had deserted. More than 1,600 were executed in 1944, but others still had faith in the brilliance of their leaders and their own fighting spirit. It was not impossible either that the Germans could count on further mistakes by the Allies, the same mistakes that had already plagued their assaults on Caen. Allied strategy around Caen had proved both faulty and costly, and there was too a strange torpor afflicting some of their units which reduced their battle effectiveness. On paper, therefore, it seemed as if the decimated German defence had little chance. On the ground, the picture was not quite so dark as this might suggest. Even before the D-Day landings in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, the Allied commanders had come to believe that wherever Allied forces met the Germans in anything like equal strength, the Germans were going to prevail. It followed from this that to triumph in Normandy, the Allies must create the most favourable conditions possible for their forces. These conditions depended in the main on the overwhelming size of the invading armies and the vastly superior numbers of their weapons. In this rather nervous scenario, the Allies would have to swamp their way to success, or not succeed at all. However, by July 1944, the steady, if slow, build-up of Allied capability in France was creating the mammoth military strength the scenario required. Already by the end of June, 875,000 Allied troops, 150,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of stores had arrived in Normandy, and replacements exceeded casualties by over 17,000 fresh troops. There was now no question that the Allies and the Germans would meet on the basis of equality, even if Allied dominance of the air were not included in the equation. The American Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, wingspan 103 feet, was a giant among the Allied aircraft of the Second World War. When first introduced in June 1939, the B-17 was the world's most advanced heavy bomber and became the most predominant used by the United States between 1942 and 1945. The 1939 model had to be upgunned several times and fitted with extra armour to become equal to the challenge of the German Luftwaffe. This requirement produced the final Flying Fortress variant, the B-17G, and 8,630 were delivered to the United States Army Air Force in Europe by April 1945, when production ceased. The B-17G Flying Fortress was manned by between 6 and 10 aircrew. Powered by 4 1,200 horsepower Wright Cyclone engines, the bomber could reach a maximum speed of 287 miles an hour and had a ceiling of 35,000 feet. With a full bomb load of 12,800 pounds, the Flying Fortress's range was 1,100 miles. For defence, the bomber carried 13 half-inch machine guns, some of them sighted in the front turret. The flamethrower was one of the horror weapons of the war, capable of engulfing and incinerating an enemy, his position, and everything else within a range of about 50 yards or more. By their very nature, flamethrowers rarely inflicted the sort of light injury that would enable an enemy to continue fighting. Under flamethrower fire, the enemy was more likely to be severely disabled by burns and too agonized to fight back. Initially, flamethrowers served different uses for the British and Americans. The Germans had already used these weapons in their Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940, and the British Expeditionary Force in Western Europe was well aware of their punishing potential. The Americans, on the other hand, realized very early what fanatical enemies the Japanese were in the Pacific, always willing to die rather than surrender, and fighting in a fashion tantamount to suicide. In the Pacific theater, the flamethrower was used against Japanese pillboxes and blockhouses. In this context, the flamethrower was less of a direct fighting weapon, more of a shortcut to avoid the slaughter that would ensue if the Japanese were allowed to deploy their full strength in more conventional warfare. Most flamethrowers used in the Second World War were portable one-man weapons. Their range was, of course, limited, but the recompense was the flamethrower's awesome effectiveness. The British 3-inch mortar and the American 81mm mortar were basically the same thing. The mortar was a fairly simple 3-inch caliber weapon requiring a 3-man team, one to carry the short stubby barrel, another to carry the base plate, the third carrying the bipod, which was adjustable, all in addition to several 3-round ammunition carriers. The mortar, which had a characteristic thud when in action, was percussion fired and had to be reloaded for each shot. After 7 weeks of near-suicidal defense, German military capability in France was on the brink of collapse. By mid-July 1944, the Germans had lost over 96,000 men, but had received only 5,200 to replace them. They'd lost 225 tanks, with only 17 received. Whole regiments had virtually ceased to exist. The remnants of 4 of them made up a battle group within the 2nd Parachute Corps, whose manpower stood at no more than 3,400 riflemen. The elite Panzer-Lehr division was reduced to 40 tanks and just over 2,000 men. This paltry strength was weakened still further after 1,500 bombers of the 8th US Army Air Force bombed the Panzer-Lehr's positions. The raid took place on the 24th of July, in bad visibility, and several bombs fell on American frontline troops. Even so, the Panzer-Lehr was virtually wiped off the face of the battlefield. Almost all its remaining tanks were lost, and barely 700 of its men survived. Essentially, the German 7th Army in France had been reduced to scratch formations, and all they had to back them up were 4 battalions of the 275th Division, all of them weak and hardly capable of holding back the onslaught of the Allies. The Jagdpanther tank destroyer was an amalgam of 2 extremely powerful weapons. The mighty PaK-43 88mm gun was mounted on the basic chassis of a Panther tank, complete with its original powertrain and lower hull. The Jagdpanther, which had an MG-34 machine gun at the front, weighed more than 100,000 pounds and was capable of a maximum 28 miles per hour. Armour was up to 4 inches thick. The Jagdpanther was a late development in German weaponry of the Second World War. It became available only just in time for the Germans to oppose the D-Day landings in June 1944. By that time, the German armaments industry was already so hard-pressed that it could produce only 382 Jagdpanthers before the war came to an end in 1945. But although comparatively few in number, the Jagdpanther had a deadly effect on the Allied armour in Normandy. The Jagdpanther could manoeuvre with ease across most types of terrain, though the Normandy bocage, with its network of small fields surrounded by thick hedgerows, considerably reduced its effectiveness. But then that applied to all tanks and self-propelled artillery that ventured in this tortuous maze. But in favourable terrain, the Jagdpanther could stand off beyond the reach of most Allied tank guns. Firing from close to 1,100 yards distance, the Jagdpanther was able to destroy Allied tanks virtually at leisure. German hand grenades were mainly designed to kill by exploding on or close to their targets. Unlike Allied grenades, there was only minimal fragmentation, so that hot and deadly fragments were not expelled by the blast when the grenade blew up. The Steyl Handgranat 24, the S-24, was a grenade of this type. It was primed by unscrewing the base and pulling on the detonation cord attached to a wooden stick. It was relatively simple to use and had a particularly effective pin mechanism. The S-24 measured around 16 inches in length. It weighed around 14 ounces and contained just under 6 ounces of explosive. This grenade was an adaptation of the stick hand grenade 23, called the potato masher by the Allied troops. The furtive nature of anti-personnel mines has always made them a much feared weapon, and minefields were extensively sown by the Germans during the Battle of Normandy. When the British and Canadians captured northern Caen, they found it was alive with mines, and the area remained dangerous for some time before they were cleared away. The S-Mine 35 was one of the Germans' smaller mines, 5 inches in height and 4 inches in diameter. Within its hidden casing, the S-35 concealed up to 18 ounces of TNT, with a firing load of 360 steel balls. It could be activated in several ways, either by a pressure trigger, or by tripwires, or by firing it electrically. Before blowing up, the S-35 would jump between 3 and 5 feet into the air by means of a propellant charge. In order to render the S-35 harmless, the tripwires had to be cut and the igniters neutralized. Then the plugs were removed so that the mine could be disarmed by removing the detonator. On the 15th of July 1944, Erwin Rommel warned Hitler that the moment was fast approaching when the hard-pressed German defences would crack. The moment arrived 10 days later, on the 25th of July. Delayed by rain, low cloud and bad visibility, Operation Cobra at last got off the ground, although it stuttered rather than leapt into life with a preliminary raid that hit the American forward positions. Over 100 GIs were killed, and nearly 500 others were injured. Nevertheless, the prestigious Panzer-Lehr division was all but destroyed, and the way was open for a full-scale Allied advance. The raid provoked the customary blaze of artillery from the German defenders, who gave their performance more credit than it was due. When the friendly fire from their own air force made the Americans hastily vacate their positions, the Germans presumed that they were withdrawing in the face of their guns. Meanwhile, there had been another distraction. Another attack was launched on the 25th of July, Operation Spring, a British and Canadian effort against the German forces south of Caen. The Germans responded quickly and forcefully. The 1st and 9th SS Panzer Divisions hit back so hard that within 24 hours the attack had to be called off. Operation Spring was, of course, a sideshow, but the Germans got the impression that it was the main Allied onslaught. This was not surprising, considering the parlous state of their intelligence and their poor communications. But while the Germans were occupied with Spring, Cobra gained unexpected time to get going before they realized their mistake. The The delay proved invaluable, clearing the ground of appreciable opposition. On the 25th of July, the US 7th Corps had pushed more than 2 miles into the German positions. On the 26th, US 8th Corps had joined in, and the Germans were pushed back a further 4 miles. These successes set up the conditions for the US 2nd Armoured Division, known as the Hell on Wheels Division, to break through into open country on the 27th of July. The next day, the US 7th Corps reached Coutances. By then, the Germans had at last realized what was happening and switched the 2nd and 17th SS Divisions to pose a threat to the Americans' flank. But it was too late. The Germans succeeded in blocking the way into Coutances for a few hours, but by the evening they'd been driven off, and the Americans were in possession. On the 30th of July, General Patton's Third Army seized the important road junction at Avranches and the southern extent of the Cotentin Peninsula. By this time, Allied forces had advanced 37 miles, covering more ground in 6 days than in the whole of the previous 7 weeks. The Normandy countryside that now lay before the Americans was a very welcome sight. At last they were out of the bocage, that obstructive maze where even their Rhino tanks equipped with blades for cutting through the hedgerows, had managed only minimal progress. By the 2nd of August, the Americans were also presented with a sweep of open country 5 miles wide at Avranches, where a gap was being held open for them by Allied air forces and armour. 4 divisions of Patton's Third Army passed through Avranches on the 3rd of August, cleared the bocage, and emerged onto the plains of Normandy. They encountered no serious resistance. The German defences had broken, just as Rommel predicted they would. More than that, the 7th Army was disintegrating into small, scattered battle groups, some no bigger than battalion size. Columns of men were wandering the countryside, looking for a way out. Most of the Germans were short of ammunition, especially for their anti-tank guns. Tanks ran out of fuel and were abandoned by the roadside. The Germans were constantly hammered from the air and sustained enormous casualties. By the 6th of August 1944, they'd lost more than 144,000 men, and replacements, when they managed to get through, numbered less than 20,000. It was a scene of chaos and despair, but as so often happened with the Germans, it was not the whole story. Where they were able to regroup and mount a defence, even where they could mobilise only a few tanks, they could still impede the Allied advance. It seemed impossible that they could turn it back, and the Allies tended to take that for granted. But it was unwise, just as it was 4 months later in the Ardennes, when the Americans were surprised by a last-ditch armoured offensive. The Führer still hoped to transform German fortunes in Normandy with a brilliant last-minute strike, and however pessimistic their own views, his commanders were still duty-bound to try to make Hitler's dreams come true. On the 3rd of August, Hitler ordered a counterattack, Operation Lüttich, to take place at Avranches 3 days later. The purpose of Lüttich was to isolate the US Third Army, turn north and crush the Normandy beachhead. This was, of course, unduly, even criminally ambitious. The Germans had to scrape together the required forces from what remained of 5 panzer divisions. Between them, they had only 185 tanks, and their mobile armoured attack would inevitably attract attention from Allied planes. Erwin Rommel, who knew about such things, would never have approved, but at the time he was out of action and out of favour. He was under suspicion for complicity in the July bomb plot to kill Adolf Hitler. Hitler's acquaintance with military realities had always been shaky, and no one else seriously believed in the success of the counterattack. But it was dangerous to gainsay the Führer. Lüttich went ahead. The German assault would begin at Mortain, which had been captured by the US 7th Corps, and the positions to be targeted were those of the 30th US Division. Hitler's purpose was to split the American forces in two, seize control of the road network around Mortain and then drive on to the coast. However, the ultra codebreakers were intercepting the German radio transmissions and warned the Allied commanders of the German plans. The panzers managed to capture Mortain, but it was of no use to them without control of the road junctions to the north, which were blocked by the Americans at l'Abbé Blanche. The strategic Hill 314, sited on the high ground east of Mortain, also eluded the Germans. The hill remained in the hands of the US 30th Division, who used it to plaster the Germans with artillery fire. But the Germans were undeterred by difficulties. They kept on attacking Hill 314, and at one point an SS officer presented the Americans with a surrender ultimatum. The Americans declined to accept. This refusal was answered by even more vigorous attacks, in which several American foxholes were overrun. In the bitter fighting that followed, the Americans on Hill 314 had to call on their artillery for rescue. But the sound and fury of the German assaults were hollow, and their successes were short-lived. The Americans sent out tanks to hunt down their infantry, and early on the 7th of August, Allied fighter bombers arrived and pounded them so heavily that half their tanks were destroyed. Next, a 5-mile advance by the panzers into the American lines came to an ignominious end when they ran out of fuel. The German armour took so much punishment that they had only 8 of their 88mm tank guns left. Field Marshal Kluge and Colonel General Hauser were so appalled at the wastage that they dared to protest when Hitler ordered the panzers to remain in position on the 9th of August. As usual, protest proved useless. Hitler issued orders for a further attack on the 11th of August in the direction of Avranches, 20 miles west of Mortain. For this purpose, all available German armour was to be concentrated on a new formation, Panzer Group Eberbach, General Hans Eberbach commanding. The new group comprised the scratchings of those forces that had been able to survive. But the German attack at Mortain had valuable uses for the Allies. The doomed German attack at Mortain fitted very neatly into General Montgomery's plan to envelop and trap the enemy between Argentan and Falaise. The Germans had been ordered not to retreat from Mortain, and this placed them just where Montgomery wanted them. On the 6th of August, Montgomery issued a directive that required the Canadian First Army to attack towards Falaise and then turn east towards the River Seine. Meanwhile, the British Second Army would move towards Argentan and also turn east. The American 12th Army was ordered to continue its eastward advance and then head for Paris. The German counterattack at Mortain and their subsequent failure to retreat while there was still time meant that the whole of their Army Group B, the remnants of the force assigned to defend Normandy, stood between the jaws of Montgomery's trap. The encirclement was amended on the 8th of August when Patton's 15th Corps was ordered to Alenion to cover the southern sector of the trap. 3 days later, the Canadians received new orders to capture both Falaise and Argentan, while the 12th US Army Group completed the entrapment by advancing to Argentan. On paper, it all appeared straightforward, but as so often happened with the Germans, the reality on the ground was different. Instead of enclosing and mopping up a depleted and dispirited enemy, the Allies found themselves fiercely resisted. One of the Germans' great strengths was their ability to switch armour, guns and men from one place in immediate danger to the next, and to do it quickly. This strategy had succeeded several times already, and now it was going to succeed again. Operation Totalize, the Canadian advance on Falaise, began on the 7th of August, but became bogged down 4 days later. The Canadians' reserves and the 1st Polish Armoured Division were fighting their first battle, and they proved unequal to the task of either capturing Falaise or driving through to Argentan to meet up with the Americans. By the 11th of August, when the Canadians came to a halt, they were only halfway to Falaise after an advance of 9 miles. The American 15th Corps, which included the 2nd French Armoured Division, had little difficulty in reaching Argenton, where they waited impatiently for the Canadians to catch up. The Canadians' next attempt, Operation Tractable, went in on the morning of the 14th of August, and this time they managed to break through to Falaise to take up positions 12 miles north of the Americans. However, valuable time had been lost. Now a huge pocket was formed with the German 7th Army, the 5th Panzer Army and Panzer Group Eberbach inside it. The only exit was at Falaise, and on the 13th of August, in a typically aggressive gesture, General Patton had tried to persuade General Bradley to let him close the gap by driving his 15th Corps north of Argenton. Bradley refused. The Allied line was too thinly stretched for him to risk a German strike against both ends. Bradley preferred to wait until troops of the 1st US Army arrived at Argenton to take over the position of the 15th Corps. Bradley was not alone in his caution. Most of the Allied commanders, except for the fiery Patton, were somewhat awed by German military tactics, which were admittedly superior. This was particularly true when their skills were likely to be exercised in as tight a corner as the Falaise Gap. The Allies also went in dread of inflicting an unacceptable casualty rate on their own forces. Add to that a lack of experience in conducting a large encirclement, and these inhibitions were going to limit the success the Allies were able to achieve at Falaise. There was, of course, no question that the Germans were going to hold the Falaise pocket. The point was how much of their decimated, exhausted army and remaining armour would be able to escape. All the Germans could do before the inevitable collapse was to hold on to every yard of ground. On the 15th of August, a German tank screen brought an advance by Canadian armour to a halt. The 3rd Canadian Division was forced to withdraw from the village of Solangui by a spirited German counterattack. The 2nd Canadian Division had better luck near Falaise. The Germans pulled back, allowing them to reach positions about a mile away. From there, the Canadians drove into the town, where the last-ditch style of the German defence was once again typified by a handful of Hitler Youth from the 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend Division. Outside, there were about 100 men of the Mount Royal Fusiliers with anti-tank guns, mortars and Bren carriers. At the end, the Fusiliers took only 4 prisoners. The rest were all dead. Falaise itself was a sea of ruin and rubble so extensive that it was impossible to make out where the streets had been. Bulldozers set to work clearing up the mess. Several hours passed before bulldozers were able to clear paths for the Canadian vehicles. The previous day, Field Marshal von Kluge informed Army Headquarters that holding the gap at Falaise was impossible. This time, and at long last, Adolf Hitler saw sense and agreed to a retreat. But he dismissed von Kluge, whom he suspected not only of complicity in the July bomb plot, but of negotiating with the Allies behind his back. Von Kluge was replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model, who found himself in charge not of an army, but of a rabble avid to get away from the killing fields of Normandy. Time for escape was now running very short. On the 17th of August, the 2nd Canadian Corps and the US 5th Corps made advances that reduced the exit from the Falaise pocket to just a few thousand yards. The Germans fought desperately to prevent it shrinking further. At the village of Saint-Lambert on the 19th of August, Canadian infantry duelled all morning with the German defenders, who forced them to dig in. The Germans mounted successive counterattacks, so the Canadians would not prevent them keeping open the route for their escape eastwards. The Germans were being helped from an unusual quarter. Elsewhere, the advance by Canadian and Polish troops was agonizingly, inexplicably slow, despite frantic urgings from Montgomery and Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, commander of the Canadian Second Corps. The Allied air forces hammered the German infantry, and tanks now pouring through the still open gap. Allied fighter bombers flew up to 3,000 sorties a day, and the slaughter and destruction were immense. But still, the Falaise Gap remained open, and still the fleeing Germans surged through, despite the deadly gauntlet they had to run. The Poles had seized the high ground at Montormel and set up machine gun positions from which they blasted down fire on the Germans passing below. They called up artillery to pound columns of German vehicles as they drove by. The Canadians, meanwhile, fired at every group of Germans they could see. The Germans were scattered, running in ones and twos from the shelter of one wood to the next. Some were picked off quickly. Some fell to the ground but managed to run on. Some lay injured, unable to continue. Some simply gave up and hoisted white flags. But by then, the ground was littered with corpses and the hulks of smoking, ruined tanks and vehicles. The gap between Argentan and Falaise was finally closed on the 21st of August, when the Canadians and the Poles linked up at Coudard. The 3rd and 4th Canadian Division managed to capture Saint-Lambert after 2 days of ferocious combat, and the US 90th Division secured Chambouis. 4 days later, Paris was liberated by the 2nd French Armoured Division. All of it should have happened earlier, and the reasons why it didn't have been subject to dispute ever since. The nature of the fighting in Normandy between the 25th of July and the 21st of August 1944 seemed inexplicable. The German forces were in a state of collapse. They were outnumbered and outgunned. They had no air cover and were constantly hammered by the Allied air forces. Their intelligence was poor and their communications were faulty. Adolf Hitler, their supreme commander, issued orders no responsible military man would ever have contemplated. By rights, the Allies should have been able to flick away their resistance and surge on into Germany with little or no difficulty. Yet it did not happen. How was this possible? The depressing fact was that in all the essentials of war, the German forces were superior. When it came to tactics, German commanders were more skilled and more adept at making the most of their resources. Their men were better motivated, better led, better trained, much more determined, and far more willing to sacrifice themselves for their cause. Among the Allied forces, only the Russians displayed the same urge to fight to the death. By the time the battle for Normandy ended at Falaise, the Germans were being hunted down all over France. The remnants of the German 7th Army were in full retreat, heading for the bridges across the River Seine. Following the invasion of southern France on the 15th of August, the German 9th Army was withdrawing in disorder up the valley of the River Rhône. In a bold, pattern-style initiative, troops of the American 6th Corps under General Lucien Truscott managed to overtake the Germans and trap them at Montélimar on the east bank of the Rhône on the 22nd of August. But Truscott was thwarted 6 days later. The 2nd Panzers counterattacked and did better than their counterparts at Falaise. They kept the escape route open long enough for most of the German forces to get away. However, they did leave behind 15,000 prisoners, and some 4,000 of their tanks and other vehicles were destroyed. This, though, was not an escape to safety. The French resistance, avid for revenge after 4 years of brutal occupation, sought and savoured every opportunity to kill, torture, or mutilate all the Boche they could find. Whole units of German soldiers wandered around looking for Allied troops to whom they could surrender. Only the haven of captivity could protect them from the fury of the French. Meanwhile, in the west, far from any chances of getting out of France, isolated German garrisons held out at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, and in the estuary of the Gironde. Brest surrendered after a long siege on the 18th of September 1944, and the rest a few months later, except for Lorient, which remained in German hands until the end of the war. The garrisons had stayed in place on Hitler's orders, but it was a futile gesture. They were nothing but specks left over from a once mighty force that had overrun and occupied France since 1940, and the zest of that triumph had long since faded. The major pursuit, of course, was in northeastern France, where the Allies were chasing their quarry towards the West Wall, the fortifications popularly known as the Siegfried Line that protected the western border of Germany. The British and Americans were still in pursuit well into September, but this was creating its own problems. The further the Allied forces were from the Normandy coast, the longer their supply lines became, and a fresh campaign would be needed to shift the Germans from more convenient ports on the Belgian coast. Meanwhile, the German forces that managed to elude the Allies' clutches had a chance to dig themselves in behind the West Wall. The fortifications, popularly known as the Siegfried Line, were 3 miles deep and had been built after 1938 to protect the western border of Germany. In 1944, reserves were rushed to the West Wall as the survivors of Normandy dug themselves in. They were in a similar state to the wall itself, battered, dilapidated, feeble. But their discipline and their will to fight was still intact, and their leadership, headed by Field Marshal von Rundstedt, was of high quality. If Normandy were anything to go by, the Allies were in for yet another costly struggle, and the war was still a long way from its end. In early September 1944, when the Allied forces were approaching the West Wall, 14 weeks had passed since the D-Day landings in Normandy. The West Wall, the fortifications protecting Germany's western border, lay 300 miles inland from the Normandy beaches. But that was not the only way the distance could be calculated. It was also measured in slog and slaughter, hardship and destruction, trauma and exhaustion. After the D-Day landings in Normandy, hundreds of thousands of men had been killed on both sides, scores of them at a time, to gain, then often lose, just a few yards of ground. Thousands of acres of countryside were laid waste and littered with the burned-out wrecks of tanks, guns and vehicles. Towns and villages were left a mess of smoking ruins. Eventually, German forces fleeing from the Battle of Normandy had been trapped in the Falaise Argentin pocket. Those who managed to escape were pursued all the way to the German border. The Germans fled in disarray, often in panic, but anyone who believed that they were finished was very much mistaken. Once they reached the safety of the West Wall, the Germans took on a new guise, no longer an exhausted enemy on the run, but defenders encased in fortifications of concrete and steel, which they believed to be impregnable. Originally, the West Wall, begun in 1938, had been Germany's answer to the Maginot Line, which protected eastern France from attack across the Rhine. The two fortifications faced each other across a short stretch of territory in the Saar region of southwest Germany, but the value of the West Wall at that time was diplomatic rather than military. Adolf Hitler found it very useful as a frightener. The West Wall, later known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, helped the Führer scare the governments of Britain and France into making concessions, so feeding their policy of appeasement. It was March 1939 when Germany invaded Czechoslovakia before the British and the French at last woke up to reality. By then, the Second World War was only 6 months away. After the German conquest of France in 1940, the West Wall became irrelevant. Its machine guns and cannon were removed and sent to the Atlantic Wall, and the fortifications fell into disrepair. Even the D-Day landings in June 1944 failed to prompt the Germans to make efforts at getting the wall into better shape. It was not until the following August, when they'd already lost the Battle of Normandy, that the Germans began to think the unthinkable. The fatherland itself might soon be invaded. The potential of the West Wall could no longer be ignored. On Hitler's orders, some 360,000 civilians and boys from the Hitler Youth were set to work repairing and rearming the dilapidated defense line. Considering the short time available, this scratch workforce achieved wonders. When they'd finished, some parts of the West Wall remained weak, but others had been greatly strengthened. And even in this state, the wall was still a formidable barrier. The fortifications formed a band of natural and artificial defences up to 5 miles deep, stretching some 400 miles from the southwest corner of the Netherlands to the Swiss border. The West Wall featured around 22,000 pillboxes, troop shelters and command posts, all interlinked and all mutually supportive. In some places, such as the rivers Rhine, Ruhr and Kiel, the terrain provided natural obstacles to invasion. Where the lie of the land failed to oblige, concrete pyramids called dragon's teeth were planted in parallel rows to obstruct attackers. Nazi propaganda, of course, touted the West Wall as impregnable. Its real purpose was not to repulse assaults, but to hold up the enemy long enough for mobile reserves to arrive and stage counterattacks. Even so, for the Allies in 1944, the difference was academic. The reality of the West Wall matched the propaganda for a very long time. Only about 12% of the German 7th Army, or rather its decimated remnants, had managed to escape from the Falaise-Argentan Gap in August 1944. But before long, these remnants had formed up along the West Wall and were soon being joined by reinforcements. The German High Command had given the western defences priority, and units were transferred from the Italian front and the garrisons in Norway and Denmark. They were also removed from the Eastern Front, even though the Russians were fast approaching the Prussian border and were about to break into Germany. Nothing underlined the emergency at the West Wall more than this. For the Germans, the Russians were the most terrifying of all enemies, and civilians awaited their arrival with dread. Nevertheless, the defence against them in the east was salted for manpower, which was rushed across Germany to face the imminent danger in the west. When all were in place, the West Wall and its adjacent areas were being defended as far as the River Mosel by Army Group B under Field Marshal Walter Model, and as far as Karlsruhe by Army Group G under General Hermann Balck. The rest of the fortifications down to the border with Switzerland was defended by SS troops under their chief, Heinrich Himmler. The enormous losses the Germans had already suffered by 1944 meant that they were unable to build up the West Wall garrison to the size its designers had envisaged. However, the problems facing the Allies gave them the chance to make the best of what they had. Exhaustion after the long chase from Falaise was only one of these problems. The Allies' other difficulties were much more fundamental. The Allied forces were suffering the usual fate of modern mechanized armies that advance too fast and too far for their support elements to keep pace with them. Their lines of supply were overstretched, and petrol and ammunition were running low. The Allied air forces and other support units were unable to extend their activities with the same speed. The Americans had no prior experience of assaulting heavy fortifications, and the lessons learned in military training proved to be of little practical use. The terrain had changed, too. Unlike the plains of Normandy, the hills and valleys of the Lorraine area around the West Wall had few roads for tanks and armoured vehicles, and in places featured dense woodland that was hard to penetrate and very difficult to fight in. The most immediate problem, however, was the shortage of fuel. It was so serious that General Patton's Third Army was brought to a halt with empty fuel tanks at the River Meuse on the 30th of August. Patton wanted to move on. He was convinced that his forces could be through the wall and at large inside Germany within 10 days. But to Patton's fury, General Eisenhower allocated what little fuel there was to his hated rival, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, for an advance into Belgium and the Netherlands by the British 21st Army Group. This offensive had two prime purposes. First, to facilitate the capture of Antwerp, a much nearer port than those in Normandy, so the Allies would be able to shorten their critically extended supply lines. Secondly, if Germany could be invaded from the north through the Low Countries, it might shorten the war and save millions of casualties. This, in fact, had been the Allies' chosen strategy when the invasion of Germany was being planned before D-Day. Montgomery's offensive proved to be a tragic disaster. Antwerp was captured on the 4th of September, but German resistance was very much stronger than expected. The Germans blocked the Scheldt estuary, making Antwerp useless for Allied purposes. By the 26th of September, the Allied airdrops at Arnhem had failed at a cost of 7,000 killed, wounded, or captured. General Eisenhower had assumed direct command of ground operations from a very resentful Montgomery on the 3rd of September, and now he was back to square one. After Arnhem, the German defences were still intact, and assaulting the West Wall the hard way, head-on, was the only remaining option. It was not a welcome prospect. Autumn was fast approaching, and with it the chance of torrential rains, mud, cold, overcast skies, and all their attendant miseries. The Allies were in for a very long haul. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, a Prussian aristocrat of the traditional military school, was not entirely trusted by Hitler, who hated his caste out of hand. Rundstedt, for his part, had contempt for both the Führer and the Nazi creed. Despite this mutual disdain, von Rundstedt kept well away from the plots to murder Hitler that occupied his fellow officers. Hitler, for his part, realized that he could not afford to waste von Rundstedt's experience and professionalism, especially after several leading officers had been removed for their involvement in the bomb plot designed to kill the Führer in July 1944. Von Rundstedt had fought in the First World War, where he distinguished himself in the Alsace campaign, and later on both the Eastern and the Western fronts. In the Second World War, he directed operations in France in 1940 and in Russia the following year, and was Supreme Commander of the German forces in Normandy at the time of the D-Day landings. Dismissed for daring to suggest that Hitler make peace, the third time in his career he'd been removed from duty, von Rundstedt was recalled 2 months later, on the 5th of September 1944, to lead the German defense of the West Wall. He remained on active service for the next 6 months, until Germany was on the brink of defeat, and retired on the 13th of March 1945, just as the Battle of the West Wall was coming to its end. After the German surrender, there was talk that von Rundstedt should be put on trial at Nuremberg. but he was regarded more as a professional soldier who had done his duty rather than a war criminal who had abused his position. Geert von Rundstedt died in 1953 at the age of 78. Field Marshal Walter Model was the complete opposite of von Rundstedt. Model shared Hitler's dislike of the Prussian military caste to which von Rundstedt belonged, and his loyalty to the Führer never wavered. In 1944, after Hitler survived the bomb plot to kill him, Model was the first commander on the Eastern Front to send him a telegram reaffirming his allegiance. Rough, aggressive and outspoken, Model's loyalty earned him an advantage not given to many other officers in the Wehrmacht. He was able to ignore the Führer's more impossible orders, act first and receive permission afterwards, and voice some very unpalatable truths. When Model took over from the disgraced Hans-Günther von Kluge as commander of Army Group B in Normandy, the first thing he did was tell Hitler that defeat in France was inevitable. Other high-ranking officers had been dismissed for less. Model's fighting experience in the war was considerable. He served in Poland and commanded the 3rd Panzer Division in Russia, as well as taking charge in Normandy in August 1944. He became known as Hitler's fireman for his skill in shoring up broken fighting fronts. His luck inevitably ran out at the West Wall. Model directed a ferocious defense of the Moselle section assigned to his Army Group B, but in the end he was forced to yield to the massive Allied onslaughts. In April 1945, Model's Army Group B was surrounded in the Ruhr pocket. Rather than accept defeat, he dissolved his forces and gave them the choice of going home, fighting on with other units, or surrendering. Model had always despised Field Marshal von Paulus for capitulating at Stalingrad in 1943 and had no intention of emulating him. Instead, he shot himself on the 21st of April 1945 because he had said a field marshal did not surrender. What is there left, he once asked, to a commander in defeat? Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges was taciturn and uncommunicative. He shunned the limelight to such an extent that General Eisenhower despaired of obtaining for him the recognition he deserved as commander of the U.S. First Army. It was possibly part of a campaign by Eisenhower to heighten Hodges' profile that his troops became the first of the Allied forces to cross the Rhine in 1945. During the interwar years, Hodges was spotted as a promising prospect by General George C. Marshall, future Chief of Staff in the Second World War, who brought him to Washington as Chief of Infantry. Early in 1944, Hodges was in England as deputy to General Omar Bradley during the planning of the D-Day landings. On the 1st of August, Hodges inherited Bradley's command as leader of the First Army. Hodges retired soon after the war as a 4-star general, and he died in 1966. With his understated manner and aversion to publicity, Hodges was one of the quiet men of the American High Command, rarely raising his voice to get things done. Unfortunately, he struck the lower ranks as cold and colourless, and had nothing like the flamboyant Patton's popular appeal. Bradley, however, appreciated Hodges' qualities, especially his insistence on detailed planning, and once said that he had implicit faith in Hodges' judgment, skill, and restraint. During the Second World War, US infantry units received close-fit support from mortars, which they called pocket artillery. The largest mortar in use at this time was the 4.2-inch chemical mortar, which weighed 330 pounds and could fire up to 20 rounds per minute, though only for short periods. Initially, the function of the chemical mortar was to provide smoke, gas, toxic agents, or incendiaries in support of infantry operations. Then, late in 1942, the 4.2-inch mortar was fitted with a high explosive capability, which greatly increased its usage for the 18 battalions that used it in the European theatre. Experiments to lengthen the range of the 4.2-inch mortar were overtaken by the end of the war in Europe, but a month later, in June 1945, tests showed that the weapon was now able to fire over distances of up to 5,600 yards. Development continued until 1951, by which time the chemical mortar had won its spurs as a legitimate infantry weapon. The pillboxes of the West Wall were strong points, arsenals and underground shelters combined. The reinforced concrete roofs were up to 7.5 feet thick, and the walls were more than 6.5 feet thick. The roof rested on steel beams up to a foot thick, and there were two 1.1-inch steel doors. The regular pillboxes of the West Wall were interspersed with larger, multi-storey structures, like the Cat's Head armoured fort near the village of Irel in the South Eifel.
Tragstühle verbinden die verschiedenen Stockwerke.
Its foundations were dug to a depth of 118 feet, and the fort contained 3 stories with reversible turret cannon, automatic flamethrowers and machine guns. The rooms were air-conditioned, providing plenty of comfort for its 84-man crew, who could remain at the Cat's Head for 6 weeks at a time. The typical West Wall pillbox was more compact. There were 2 entrances with a large gas-proof chamber between them. On the right, a short staircase led up to the arms room, with an ammunition bunker attached, and another 37 feet square beyond that. A second arms room, nearly 99 feet square, was sited at the rear. The approaches to the pillbox were protected by minefields, booby traps and barbed wire. The remainder of the accommodation consisted of troop quarters. The first of them was 190 feet square, and the second, measuring 81 feet square, had a locker attached. These pillboxes were like miniature fortresses in their own right, and in March 1945 one of them managed to hold up a division 15,000 strong for several hours. Explosive charges laid against the steel door blew a few holes, but the door failed to yield. It was only when grenades were tossed inside through the holes in the door that the stubborn strongpoint was finally overcome. Colonel Charles Buck Lanham was commander of the 22nd Regiment, the 4th Division of General Patton's 3rd Army, stationed in the Eifel Plateau region of western Germany. On the 13th of September 1944, Lanham informed his battalion officers of a plan for assaulting the West Wall that was simple, straightforward, and, he felt confident, was going to work. 3 battalions would attack the West Wall pillboxes, sited on the Black Man, the heights above the hamlet of Boucher, then move on to the pillboxes at the small village of Brandschied. The 3rd Battalion was to go in first, break through the wall and open the way for 2 further battalions to follow and complete the attack. After that, the entire 4th Division could surge through the wall and head for the Rhine. The 3rd Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Teague, advanced towards the Black Man Heights, carefully using the terrain to keep out of sight of the West Wall defenders. Some of the Americans were carrying flamethrowers. Meanwhile, American artillery was blasting the German positions. At first, there was no reaction from the West Wall. The Germans were evidently waiting for the right moment. When it came, It was devastating. Mortar fire plunged down on the 3rd Battalion, and the Germans' MG-42s began to clatter out streams of bullets. Americans keeled over, one after the other, until they lay in a pattern of patches on the hillside. Before long, the wounded were being dragged down the hill and back to the regiment's positions. All around, the cry went up for the medics. At length, Colonel Lanham realized that his men were on the brink of losing the battle. He drew his pistol and fired a couple of shots in the air, yelling at his reserves to get up and go. Eventually, they went, picking their way around the bodies still lying on the slopes. Lanham's plan proceeded, despite the ferocity of the German fightback. The 3rd Battalion moved south to Brandschied, but it was no sleepy little village. Unknown to Lanham or Teague, the place was spiked all around with pillboxes. A tough German battle group, Kampfgruppe Körner, was there, together with SS troops, to dismiss the American efforts with a furore of fire. Teague decided to dig in and try again the next day. The 3rd Battalion went on trying for another 2 weeks, but they got nowhere. The 22nd Regiment, meanwhile, attempted another approach, reducing the German bunkers one by one. This was no small enterprise, and at first the Americans tried to get the Germans to surrender. When they refused, tank destroyers were driven up to the steel doors and blasted them in at point-blank range. It was a dangerous maneuver for the attackers, but it worked. The survivors emerged, most of them badly injured. The dead were piled up inside. Before long, American casualties had mounted to 800 men, some of them killed when the Germans launched a counterattack out of their pillboxes. Half of the 1st Battalion were killed or injured, and only 2 of their officers survived. Many casualties were physically uninjured, but developed combat fatigue. Eventually, Colonel Lanham was forced to call off the attack as the weather worsened and the German defences showed no signs of lessening. Nothing had been gained, and the vital roads leading out of the Eifel region to the Rhine remained under German control. The wall remained intact. The next attempt at the West Wall was made from the Duchy of Luxembourg by the US 28th Infantry Bloody Bucket Division belonging to Courtney Hodges' First Army. The division's reputation for record casualties was furthered at the West Wall, where they were facing a crack force, the 2nd SS Division. As the Americans advanced across the minefields, the Germans saturated the battlefield with mortar and machine gun fire. Within a week, American casualties had reached 1,500 killed and injured. One entire company, F Company, disappeared so completely that no trace was ever found of them. Despite this fearsome defense, the Bloody Bucket Division pushed forward on a narrow front and captured several high points. But these were of little use to them when the 2nd SS Division still held the low ground. Even so, on the 16th of September, the Bloody Bucket scored a notable first. In what the official history described as a pencil-like penetration, they had breached the West Wall. In practical terms, it meant little. The disappearance of F Company had taken the heart out of the Americans' efforts, and they were ordered to wind up operations. A further attempt at the West Wall, made soon afterwards by the 5th Armoured Victory Division, managed to get through the fortifications to a position 6 miles inside German territory. But this initiative led to a mammoth German counterattack, overseen by Field Marshal von Rundstedt himself. Outnumbered, assaulted on both flanks by German infantry and armour, denied air cover when the weather turned nasty, the Victory Division began to falter. On the 19th and 20th of September, they were ordered to pull back. Pencil-thin penetrations were of no interest to General George Patton, commander of the Third Army. As he told newspaper reporters, "I'm going to go through the wall like shit through a goose." By the 5th of September, Patton's enforced halt at the River Meuse came to an end, as supplies of fuel to the Third Army began to flow again. Patton ordered the 12th and 20th Corps to seize the city of Nancy, the capital of Lorraine, as a prelude to breaking through the West Wall and crossing the Rhine. Patton envisaged no serious difficulty. The section of the West Wall immediately facing the Third Army was manned by 7 weak infantry divisions and a panzer brigade of the German First Army. Also in the vicinity were 7 under-strength divisions of the German 19th Army. Hardly an impressive opposition. However, even with this poor showing, this was one of the best defended parts of the West Wall, and Field Marshal Mördl, Hitler's fireman, was in overall charge. Elements of the Third Army set out for the Mosel River close to Nancy on the 11th of September. The Americans crossed the river, and though there was some heavy German resistance, it did not seriously impede their progress. Nancy was duly occupied on the 15th of September. At this juncture, the Americans had to halt for 4 days through lack of supplies and provisions, and the onset of bad weather. The delay gave the Germans the opportunity to regroup and concentrate reserves from their First Army at Château Salins, where they blocked one of the main routes to the Rhine. This meant the Americans had lost the initiative, and the 5th Panzer Army hit them with a series of major strikes at Patton's 4th Armoured Division. The contest continued for 10 days and took on a regular pattern. The Germans attacked under cover of fog and fought a series of vigorous engagements with the Americans. The Americans, who were aided, weather permitting, by aircraft of the 18th Tactical Air Command, outmaneuvered the panzers and forced them to withdraw. Finally, wrecked panzers littered the battle area, and the Germans were down to only 25 tanks. Wisely, they withdrew. In all, they'd lost around 280 tanks and suffered 3,000 casualties, with the same number taken prisoner. American losses were fewer, 626 casualties. But almost non-stop fighting over the past 2 months had exhausted them. They were retired from the Lorraine area on the 12th of October to rest, recoup, and refit. The West Wall remained untouched. Nine days later, to his chagrin, Patton lost the honour of making the first permanent breach in the fortifications. It happened at Aitken, a historic city on the German border with Belgium and the Netherlands. Aitken was fortified, but its defences were not unusually strong, and though it formed part of the West Wall, its position was of no strategic significance. Nevertheless, the capture of Aitken, the first appreciable city the Allies had encountered on German soil, could prove an important boost to morale. Dealing with Aitken fell to Courtney Hodges' First Army. Hodges' plan was to break through the West Wall north and south of the city, surround and neutralize it, while the bulk of his forces pushed on eastwards towards the Rhine. However, German resistance was so ferocious that it became impossible for the First Army to perform these 2 tasks at once. Hodges had to choose, and he chose to assault Aitken. The units originally intended for the Rhine were to play a backup role and prevent the Germans from relieving the city. Adolf Hitler fully realized the importance of Aitken and issued his usual orders to the 5,000 Germans defending it. Fight to the last man, never retreat, and die if necessary. The casualties that resulted from such fanatical defense had already proved so high that Hodges attempted to cut short the proceedings. He issued a surrender ultimatum on the 10th of October. As he no doubt expected, it was refused. Hodges now ordered his forces to attack. They were to demarcate the battle area by artillery and mortar fire, dominate the main thoroughfares and intersections with machine guns, and move infantry, tanks and tank destroyers along the side streets. All the while they would maintain maximum fire to ensure that no German could escape. While the defenders were being held in thrall in this fashion, buildings would be collapsing all around them, and it would bury them in the ruins. The initial bombardment of Aitken was delivered by 12 artillery battalions, which plastered the city with 10,000 rounds in 2 days. Meanwhile, fighter bombers of the 9th Tactical Artillery Command dropped over 160 tons of bombs on the target in the same period. By noon, heavy fighting was taking place inside Aachen. Nevertheless, by the end of the day, the Americans were ready to blast their way through to the city centre. It was not that easy. For the next week, Aachen saw a ferocious struggle as the American tanks and tank destroyers hammered away with heavy caliber fire, using the powerful 155mm artillery pieces to blow entire buildings apart. The 155mm worked on the Germans like a terror weapon. Later, the German commander in Aachen, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, condemned it as barbarous and called for it to be banned. Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Daniel, commander of the 2nd Battalion, had quite another description for the 155mm, quite spectacular and satisfying. By the afternoon of the 21st of October, Daniel's 2nd Battalion had secured the business areas of Aachen and were pushing westwards when they learned the fight was over. Contrary to Hitler's orders, the garrison of Aachen had surrendered. The Americans captured 1,000 prisoners. According to their own reports, the Germans had suffered around 5,000 casualties. Quite probably, a lot more men were killed. The Americans lost around a tenth of that number, most of them among the assault troops. After the battle, only around 20% of Aachen's buildings were left standing. Even before the capture of Aachen, the 9th Infantry Division of Hodge's First Army was ordered into the Hürten forest, southeast of the city, to clear it as security for the right flank of another effort against the West Wall, a major assault across open country aimed at penetrating the fortifications. The Hürten was a man-made forest around 200 square miles. There were few roads. It was difficult fighting country, certainly for tanks and armoured vehicles, and the Americans expected only light resistance. They were wrong. Although the German 7th Army was not well prepared to defend the forest, once the Americans entered, they fought with their customary ferocity to keep them back. By October, the 9th Airborne Division had suffered 4,500 casualties for an advance of less than 2 miles. The battle in the forest now took on the proportions of a major struggle, and one in which the Germans always seemed to be one jump ahead. In November, Hodges ordered the 28th Bloody Bucket Infantry Division to advance through the forest to seize the high ground at Schmidt. Schmidt lay north of the important dams on the River Ruhr. Rain and fog intervened to cause delays, giving the Germans time to target the invasion. During the subsequent fighting, the Americans lost 6,000 casualties in one of the most costly actions of any they fought in the war. An action initially intended to be an easy ride had quickly turned into a nightmare. The forest floor was thickly sown with anti-personnel mines. Shells bursting high in the treetops fell down in showers of deadly metal fragments onto soldiers picking their way through a mess of broken branches and slippery leaves. As the winter wore on, there was rain, mud, sleet, and snow. It was all too easy to get lost in the tangle of trees and stumble into ambushes. The German defense, ferocious as always, had an extra specific purpose. The top-secret Watch on the Rhine, the deliberately misnamed offensive due to take place in the Ardennes in December, could have been jeopardized if the Americans managed to cross the River Ruhr, which ran through the forest. The Ruhr itself was of great importance to the Germans. If the Americans crossed the river, now or in the future, they could be isolated by floods caused by opening the Ruhr dams. Ideally, the flooding might prevent them crossing at all. The cost on both sides was very high. By mid-October, the Germans had lost around 2,000 killed and injured, and 1,200 taken prisoners. American losses were even greater, 4,500 men killed, wounded, or missing. November 1944 went on as September and October had begun. Massive American assaults, accompanied by fighter-bomber attacks, did nothing to break down the German resistance, which was so powerful that the Bloody Bucket Division lost 40% of its strength in 7 days. On the 15th of November, 1,200 flying fortresses of the US Army 8th Air Force flew from the Netherlands to soften up the enemy for the US 84th Division at Geilenkirchen, north of Aachen. But the result was the same, a fearful battle of attrition in which the infantry suffered so many losses they were unable to continue. By December 1944, the Americans had been dashing themselves against the West Wall for 3 months, and despite the victory at Aachen, they were getting nowhere. The Hürten Forest became a microcosm of this failure. After the Bloody Bucket Division was withdrawn, another armoured division and 4 more infantry divisions were sent in, only to be shredded in their turn. None of them lasted more than 2 weeks before they were replaced by the next. The ultimate responsibility for breaking this impasse lay with General Eisenhower. After such a long time, so many losses and so many failures, he might well have felt that his job was on the line. Even worse, the outcome of the war could be in the balance. Inside their defences, the Germans had proved too strong to shift. Instead, Eisenhower sought to lure them out of their fortifications so the Americans could meet them on open ground, where they had a better chance to prevail. Eisenhower laid a trap, the so-called Ghost Front in the Ardennes, where the American defences were thin and the Germans might fancy their chances of success. In fact, Eisenhower had 14 armoured divisions waiting in the wings to fall on them once they emerged. In the meantime, the frontal attacks on the wall continued. There was no major breakthrough, but there were some gains. The Americans captured the important crossroads leading to the defences in the Hürten Forest and the Wallerscheid crossroads north of Monschau. The west wall itself was penetrated to a depth of 1,200 yards. On the 16th of December 1944, the Germans appeared to fall for Eisenhower's trap. They came out of their fortifications, but not to assault the Americans with their understrength manpower. In one of the worst cases of bad luck coincidence in military history, Eisenhower's trap was preempted by the Ardennes offensive, the last-gasp initiative by 24 German divisions to throw back the Allies and possibly win the war. The Allies never imagined that at this late stage in the war the Germans were capable of mustering such a force. But the Ardennes offensive did not last long. After initial successes, fuel supplies ran out, and in early January 1945, it was all over. On the 16th of January 1945, 8 days after the end of the Ardennes offensive, British forces under Bernard Montgomery, now a field marshal, took their turn at cracking the West Wall. Their target was the Heinsberg salient, around 20 miles long, which was defended by 3 lines of fortifications, continuous trenches and weapons pits covered by barbed wire and liberally sown with mines. The Germans had 2 infantry divisions in the salient, with 156 guns and 18 assault guns, all of them spread over muddy terrain that was difficult and dangerous to traverse. Montgomery's forces consisted of 2 infantry divisions, the 43rd and the 52nd Lowland Division, and the very tough, very hardy 1st Commando Brigade. US General Patton was not at all happy about the prospect of Montgomery, his hated rival, gaining the honour of being the first to reach the Rhine. At the end of January 1945, Patton, with help from General Bradley, persuaded Eisenhower to agree to an armoured reconnaissance in the Eifel region that would take his forces across the rivers Our and Sauer to close in on the West Wall. The term armoured reconnaissance was somewhat vague, and Patton preferred it that way. For him, it was a means to an end. Patton wasn't planning a reconnaissance at all. He aimed to get his Third Army so committed to the battle at the West Wall that Eisenhower would have to agree to their participation. The guns of Patton's Third Army opened up on the morning of the 29th of January 1945 and began pounding the fortifications. The weather was foul. It began to snow as the assault battalion of the 4th Infantry began to advance. They slid across the frozen Ur River and then blasted their way through Brandsheed with artillery, tank fire and flamethrowers. The Germans fought back, but in the ferocious hand-to-hand fighting that ensued, they were pushed back. Although they managed to win back the village of Brandsheed, there'd been a partial breakthrough of the west wall near the town of Prüm. By this time, Patton had expected confirmation from Eisenhower to proceed towards Mosul. When contact was eventually made, Patton was infuriated to be told that the Third Army must stay put, go on the defensive, and await further orders. Orders, when they came through, were not of much comfort to Patton. The hated Montgomery had received sanction for 14 British divisions to begin a fresh attack against the northern positions on the West Wall, starting on the 10th of February. All Patton was allowed to do was continue operations in the Eifel region until that date. After Montgomery's attack went in, Patton turned to making preparations for a separate assault by his Third Army on the centre of the West Wall. But attempts at preserving the element of surprise suffered setbacks. The Germans suspected that something big was afoot, and they were certain of it when the Third Army suddenly imposed radio silence. At 0100 hours on the 7th of February 1945, Patton's artillery, including 155mm guns, began roaring out shells towards the German positions across the River Sauer. Under cover of this bombardment, men of the Third Army's 12th Corps set out across the river in 36 rubber boats, formerly belonging to the German Luftwaffe. They ran into a massive blast of German fire, which only one of the boats survived. But a sufficient number of Americans managed to reach the other side of the river to form up and mount attacks on the West Wall pillboxes. This time, the Americans attacked them from the rear, the only way of tackling them that offered a real chance of success. The result was a series of blackened, blasted back doors, and crews so shocked at the suddenness of the onslaught that many of them panicked and surrendered. For the next week, the Americans continued destroying pillboxes, 40 of them to each square mile. But the breaching of the West Wall in the Eifel region was only a local success. The fortifications running from Trier on the Mosel down to the Swiss border were still intact. Patton, unwilling to lose the momentum, wanted to continue his attack, cross the River Mosel and assault Trier, then drive on through to the Rhine. The Third Army did, in fact, capture Trier on the 1st of March, after a very stiff fight lasting 3 days. But the rest of Patton's plan did not accord with official strategy. Montgomery's assault in the Reichswald forest still had priority. Unfortunately, his campaign had degenerated into a grim slogging match. Although his British and Canadian forces had succeeded in breaking through the West Wall to the north, more than 15,600 men had been lost, and the end of February arrived before the struggle showed signs of ending. If eventually Montgomery's forces were to attack across the Rhine into the industrial region of the Ruhr, it would have to be on a narrow front. This enabled General Omar Bradley, whose interests were much the same as Patton's, to propose a backup position for the American forces. The First and Third Armies would advance to the Rhine before Montgomery made his attempt at a crossing. What Bradley was really doing was seeing to it that American troops were in a position to be first across the Rhine, and first to spill out into the rest of Germany. During the assault on the River Sauer, the 4th Armoured Division of Patton's Third Army advanced on Bitburg, which they meant to use as a springboard for their own drive to the Rhine. By the 5th of March, the Allied assaults on the West Wall during the previous few days had opened the way for them. They left Bitburg, and 2 days later, on the 7th of March, the division's lead tanks reached the Rhine. The same morning, the US 9th Armoured Division of Hodge's First Army arrived at the Ludendorff railway bridge at Remagen, just as German engineers were preparing to blow it up, The Germans exploded some of their charges, but the bridge survived long enough for American infantry to cross the Rhine and establish the first Allied bridgehead on the other side. 10 days later, the bridge at Remagen collapsed into the river. Although much of the West Wall remained in German hands, it had failed in its prime purpose, to keep the Allies out of Germany. The Allied drive to the Rhine had effectively bypassed the fortifications and made them redundant once again. On the 20th of March, the 9th Armoured Division made a final assault on the West Wall. The Americans approached warily, expecting the pillboxes to explode with fire. There was none. The pillboxes were empty. Most of the defenders had gone. Some remained at their posts and surrendered. Others fled under cover of darkness. A few ransacked the ruins of houses for clothes, assumed civilian guise, and kept on running. Once the Allied forces were across the Rhine, it was only a matter of time before the Third Reich collapsed. This did not prevent the Germans from fighting on, and another 2 months passed after the crossing of the Rhine at Remagen before their surrender on the 7th of May 1945. By then, the West Wall had played its part in deciding the new shape of Europe and the nature of post-war politics, for the way in which it was finally overcome did not arise from purely military considerations. The Low Countries and northern Germany had come under Montgomery's overall command, so that taking this route to invade the Third Reich, as envisaged before D-Day, would have brought American forces under British control. However, the American generals were too chauvinistic to stand for that. This applied particularly to General Patton, whose name for Montgomery was unprintable, and to a lesser extent to General Bradley. To Patton, the idea that his hated rival might be the first to reach the Rhine was anathema. As for General Bradley, he had his own secret agenda in February 1945, when he suggested that Hodges' First Army and Patton's Third Army should mass at the Rhine to cover Montgomery's narrow front thrust across the river. This was important insurance against the Germans staging another Ardennes-style offensive. But it was no coincidence that it also made sure that the Rhine crossing would be an all-American enterprise. General Patton had made his own contribution to this state of affairs. By turning his aggressive defense at the West Wall into an aggressive offense, he drew the focus of American operations southwards. This was the wrong position for a speedy drive to Berlin, and meanwhile the Russians gained the time to move in from the east and reach the German capital first. Subsequently, this enabled them to claim for communism a larger share of Europe than the British and the Americans meant them to have. And for the next 45 years, until communism collapsed in Europe and the Cold War came to an end, the world had to live with the consequences.